So I was mentioning to you backstage, I'm not supposed to have favorite sessions, but this is a favorite session of mine. And part of it is because of you and how you, I just have a lot of respect for how you hold yourself in the world and how you carry yourself in the world. And I also have a lot of respect for tackling something that is very hard for us to talk about. So we're going to talk about loneliness and how we address loneliness. And I think if you walk around society, it would look like we're all happy. And we all have our phones, and we're all busy on our phones, and we all have friends and people that we're trying to communicate with, and yet there's this underlying loneliness that is prevalent. And I really am so happy that you're addressing that and coming out with a book called Together, which will be out in a few months. But I thought we would begin by just kind of talking about what loneliness is. What is the experience of loneliness versus isolation or versus another experience? So could you talk about a little bit about what we know about the feeling of loneliness or the experience of loneliness?
Absolutely. And let me just say how grateful I am for the opportunity to be here with all of you. Even when I was serving in government, I had heard so much about the Wisdom 2.0 community and had heard a lot about Soren, but I'd never had a chance to experience the community. So it's a real privilege to be here this weekend with all of you. You know, if you had told me, Soren, that if you told me 5 years ago that I'd be here with you and this is what we'd be talking about, loneliness, I would have said you were probably wrong. But I came to learn about loneliness and to be educated on it, really, not just through life experience, but by the people that I met across the country in small towns and big cities all across America. And to start with, what is loneliness? That was the question that often comes up. And I'll tell you what it is and what it's not. So loneliness is a subjective feeling that we are lacking in social connections in our life. And that's the difference between the connections you need and what you feel you have. Now, the reason I mention that is because what we feel we need might be different for each of us. And so by definition, loneliness is a subjective term. It's in contrast with isolation, which is an objective term that describes the number of people that you may have around you. But loneliness is really what I started to see more and more when I was traveling around the country. When I began my tenure in government, I started with a listening tour, and I was just asking people a very basic question, which is, how can I be of service? And I would try to just shut up and listen to what people had to say. Didn't always succeed, but I tried my best. But what I heard were often stories that were not that surprising. There were stories of addiction, stories about depression and anxiety, stories about obesity and concerns people had about chronic illnesses in their community. What I didn't expect, though, was what was behind those stories, which were threads of loneliness, and people would never come up to me and say, my name is Soren, my name is Vivek, I'm lonely. But they would say things like this. They would say, I walk around every day and I feel invisible. They would say, I feel like if I disappeared tomorrow, it just wouldn't matter. I feel like I have to deal with all of this stuff, illness, financial challenges, and other struggles, all on my own. There's nobody there who's looking out for me. These are the kind of things that people would say. And so I began to surface it more intentionally. And I started asking in town halls and in small community meetings, how many people feel that loneliness is a struggle for us or for the people we love? And I'll tell you that it was like a reaction that I've not seen to any other topic that I talked about during my entire time in office. And during my time in office, I had to work on many different public health issues. And I could tell sometimes when a subject just did not resonate with people versus when it was a cerebral connection they would make, like Zika virus was an example of that. People would say, okay, well, I understand the risks here. I understand what I have to do to prevent it. Okay, I can put two and two together, and sure, I'll take those precautions. But the reaction here was very different. It was a much deeper, visceral reaction that stemmed from people either having experienced loneliness or having seen it in their lives among the people they loved. And this is true whether I was talking to fishermen in remote villages in Alaska or talking to members of Congress in Washington, D.C., or people elsewhere in the country. And that was my first signal that there is something deeper happening here, something that is far more common, but that's behind the shadows that I need to understand and figure out.
And can you talk about some of the repercussions of loneliness? Like I know that you mentioned in your book there's some interesting studies that show life expectancy is impacted by loneliness, work satisfaction is impacted by loneliness. Can you talk about some of the impacts that feeling lonely can have on our personal selves and also on society?
Absolutely, and this is all things that I learned over the last few years as I began to realize that loneliness is not only incredibly common, but it's also very consequential. Um, a word about how common it is. If you take more conservative studies that have lower numbers, what you'll find is that they peg loneliness rates around 22% among adults in the United States. But there are other studies that put those numbers much higher. Studies also put loneliness rates among adults at around 25% in the UK, around 25% in Australia. Many countries around the world are struggling with double-digit percentages of their population that are saying that they are struggling with loneliness. Now, those are the number of people who are saying that they are on surveys. The real number is almost undoubtedly higher than that because of the unfortunate stigma around loneliness that makes people feel that if they admit being lonely, either to themselves or to others, that's the same as admitting that they're not likable or that they're not lovable. And nobody wants to feel that way about themselves. This is true for me as well. One of the reasons this issue resonated with me was that I myself have struggled with loneliness at many times in my life, and starting in my childhood, where I had an amazing life at home. I had parents and a sister who loved me and made me feel like I belonged. But school was tough. I was a really shy kid. The hardest time of the day was lunchtime, going to that cafeteria and trying to figure out who to sit with. I actually wanted to hang out with other kids. I was just really shy, and it just took me a while to figure out what to say and how to connect with them. So it was difficult. It was difficult. And I remember how deeply that impacted me, and waiting every day for the bell to ring at 3 o'clock so that I could just, flee home and be in a secure and safe environment with my parents and my sister. So that really, stuck with me. But the thing that also what I didn't realize at that time was just how much of loneliness I would start to see in my professional life. I became a doctor inspired by my father and by my mother, and thought, as an internal medicine doctor, that I would be mainly, handling cases of diabetes and high blood pressure and infections and cancer and viruses like the coronavirus and things of that sort. What I didn't expect was that I would be seeing loneliness as commonly as I did. In fact, I often reflected in the years that followed that loneliness was actually the most common condition I encountered as a doctor, and it truly was. But it showed up in insidious ways. I remember first getting into the hospital as a third-year medical student and realizing that many of the patients who were coming in were coming alone. And often these were difficult moments in their life where a big illness had hit, or they had a turn in a chronic illness and now had to make a big decision about whether to get a major surgery or whether to get a new treatment. And I would often ask, is there somebody that you want me to call, somebody that we should ask to come in so that we can all make this decision together? There's a lot of difficult decisions to make by oneself. And so often the answer that I would get was, no, there's no one to call. Even at the end of life, and I've been privileged to be able to be with many patients in those final days and at the time of passing. But what was most sad to me was that for so many of those patients, I and the other staff in the hospital were the only ones there at those final moments in their lives. And so even despite all of those experiences, my personal experience and experience in the hospital, it wasn't until I served in office and had a chance and the privilege of meeting people around the country that I realized this is not unique to me or to my experience in the hospital. This is far more common. And it's also consequential. So what we know is that people who struggle with loneliness have a higher risk of heart disease, of dementia, of depression, of anxiety. Their sleep is actually disturbed, it's fractured. So even though you might sleep 8 hours, that fractured sleep is less restful. Their healing recovery times tend to be longer. And what's really interesting and sort of peculiar and something that we have to understand more about is it also seems that there's a strong association between loneliness and mortality. So people who are lonely seem to live shorter lives. And the amount by which their life is shortened seems to be similar to the mortality impact of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. It's also greater, in fact, than the mortality impact of obesity or of sedentary living.
So you'd be better off having a great family and a great community and smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Well, while we're still figuring out the exact values and relationships here, I think the strong hint this is giving us is that we have probably significantly underestimated the health impact of loneliness. And I say this, as a Surgeon General who, like my predecessor, spent a lot of time on those three issues I just mentioned, on obesity, on physical activity, on tobacco-related disease. And with good reason, there's a lot of data that shows those are still driving a lot of disease and death in our society. But what was not on my radar during all of medical school, during all my time practicing medicine, was the issue of loneliness as a profound health concern.
And if you address loneliness, potentially you're addressing a lot of other issues that might come from loneliness, right? Addiction might come from loneliness, or other things that would be at the root of that. I think the challenge with loneliness is that it's hard for me to admit when I'm lonely, and therefore it's hard for me to get support. How have you noticed that people who go from being isolated or lonely to having rich social connections? What are some of the steps or practices that we can do that kind of move us from being in a more lonely place to a more connected place?
Yeah, this is such a good question because it can be really paralyzing, the experience of loneliness. And part of the reason it's paralyzing, actually, there are three quick reasons I'll tell you. One is that, number one, when we're lonely, we actually move into an elevated threat state. And what I mean by that is that, like, if you imagine thousands of years ago when we were wandering in the tundra, if we were separated from our tribe, that meant that our survival was at risk. We were more likely to get attacked by predators, to have an unstable food supply. And over thousands of years, that became baked into our nervous system, such that when we're separate from the people that we need, when we have that experience, of having insufficient social connection, that puts us in a state of stress. Now, in the short term, we know stress can be helpful. It can actually elevate your performance. It can enable you to bring the best out of yourself. It can be adaptive. But in the long term, if you're experiencing stress, as you do in chronic loneliness, then that stress can actually turn around and go from elevating your performance to actually harming your body and contributing to illness and to disease. And so that's one of the reasons why this threat state is so important. The other thing that happens, though, with loneliness is we turn inward. And this is understandable because when you're in a state of threat, you want to focus on yourself because you feel that you're at risk. But this can be really problematic. Many of you may have had the experience of going out and interacting with somebody who seems to always be a little suspicious of others and seems to be more overly focused on themselves. And my guess is that many of you, as I have done in the past, tend to just move on to the next person in conversation, right? Because it's not always as pleasant to interact with folks like that. And that's one of the reasons why loneliness actually creates a negative spiral. But the last reason is the most insidious, which is that loneliness actually erodes our sense of self, our confidence in ourselves over time. We start to believe, if we go long periods being lonely, that there's a reason why we're lonely, that it's because we're not likable or because we're not lovable. And the worse our confidence and esteem become, the harder it is to summon the courage to go and take a risk and interact with people who are new. So the ways that I've found that people can address this have to do with breaking those cycles. And one of the most powerful ways to break those cycles of loneliness is actually to engage in acts of service. Wow. What is so powerful about service is that service actually shifts our focus away from ourselves onto somebody else. It also reminds us and reaffirms to us that we have value to bring to other people's lives and to the world. And in that sense, it can be affirming and have a positive impact on our self-esteem. And service doesn't just have to be volunteering at an organization in your community or at a soup kitchen. Service can also be the help that you afford to people in your life, the assistance you give to someone in the workplace who's struggling, the support you might give to a neighbor who's having a hard time because someone in their family just lost their job or they're struggling with illness. There are many ways to serve if we're only willing to look for them. The other ways that I've found in terms of strategies that help with loneliness are to rethink our use of time, right? So in an ideal world, we would spend many hours more, with people we love and people who know us than we actually do. But the truth is it's hard in the modern world to immediately go from where you are to having many more hours to just dedicate to friends. So in the interim, though, the two things that we can do are, number one, to dedicate a small amount of time, just 5 minutes a day, to reaching out to someone that you love. And that could be calling them, it could be video conferencing them, it could be sending a text to an old friend that you've been thinking about saying, hey, I was just thinking of you, and remembering that conversation we had a couple of years ago and brought a smile to my face. These small moments of interaction, 5 minutes, 2 minutes worth of interaction, can have a powerful impact on how we feel. But also related to time is the quality of our time. If we spent no more time with our loved ones than we do now, but we only improve the quality of that time, we would do a huge amount to increase the connection that we feel in our lives. Now, why is our quality of our time being diluted? Well, in part because we're bringing a lot of other things into it. So, and technology being the prime culprit here. But how many of us have, for example, been on the phone catching up with a friend and have also been scrolling through, our inbox or looking at the news or social media at the same time? How many of us have caught up with a friend over dinner and have had our phones out on the table with alerts lighting up our phone from time to time? We do this not because we're bad people. We do this not because we don't care about the people we love. And I have done these things as well. But we do them because the seductive nature of our devices is incredibly powerful, and they were designed to be that way. And while they can help us in some ways connect to people who might be long-lost friends and stay in touch with loved ones who are far away, if we don't draw boundaries around them, they can start to reduce the quality of our day-to-day relationships. So thinking about service, thinking about how we improve the quality of our time with our loved ones, thinking about committing a small amount of time on a regular basis, on a daily basis, to reaching out to people we love. These are just 3 of a longer list of strategies that I was able to learn from so many of the people that I met around the country.
And I know that the loneliness rates have skyrocketed over the last couple decades, or increased significantly from reading your book. Is the cause technology? Is that, or are there multiple causes? Because it would appear that there's people, for example, here we have thousands of friends on a social network, and we're communicating with them. Do you know, to what extent that's actually decreasing our loneliness, or that's actually not helping, or is it direct human connection that's actually really the gold standard for what we need?
It's a good question, and it's a puzzling question that I think we still don't 100% know the answer to. But what we do know is that in addition to being, consequential, that we know that loneliness rates are high. Whether they're growing or not, and how fast they might be growing, that's a little bit hard to know. If you look at, for example, surveys from Cigna, the health insurer, that were done in 2018 and 2020, it seems like, according to their studies, that there was an increase in loneliness between those 2 years. But in cases like that, the question is, was there a real increase in loneliness, or are people more comfortable saying that they're lonely, so it's showing up more on surveys? This is part of what we're trying to understand and tease out. But whether loneliness is growing or not, I still think it's profoundly important because of how common it is, because of how much of an impact it has on our health. And I think there are at least a few different drivers, for it. One is certainly mobility. We're more mobile now than we were a half century ago. That has afforded us extraordinary opportunities, but it also means that we move away from communities that we know and that we love. The second thing I think that's contributing to loneliness, the second factor, is how we are using technology. See, technology in and of itself is a tool. It's a neutral tool, and we can actually use it to strengthen connection, by video conferencing with people that we love who are far away, who we might not get to see, by having text threads with close groups of friends where we can share what's happening in our lives, and even though we're not able to see each other face to face.
Or send gratitude, thoughts of gratitude or love.
Exactly. We can do that much more easily now. When I was a child, I remember having to write on these blue aerogram forms that some of you may remember, in order to send letters to my grandfather and my grandmother, who lived half a world away in India. And it would take 2 weeks for the letter to get there, and then we'd have to wait another 2 weeks for the letter to come back. And that's how we communicated with our grandparents, and it's so much easier now. But the challenge with how we use technology today is that I worry that we have, number one, ended up substituting lower quality connections online for what used to be higher quality connections. I think number two, I think the way we use technology has shifted our time so that it is easier to wish 100 contacts on Facebook happy birthday than it is to spend the half hour to call a good friend and have a conversation with them on their birthday. So it's actually made interaction easier in our middle and outer circles, but actually detracted, I think, from the time that we spent with our inner circles. And I think the other challenge, and this is true of social media in particular, is that in addition to these other factors, in addition to the dilution and distraction from our relationships that comes from technology at times, I also worry about the culture of self-comparison that exists in social media and online. And that self-comparison often makes people feel worse about themselves. You know, as one of my friends said, the experience of going through your feed on social media is the experience of comparing other people's best days to your average days. And
I've never posted a picture of my wife and I arguing, and I've never seen it, even though it happens. But if we're in a good, pleasant place,
yeah, people have. And the funny thing is, people aren't posting these happy pictures to make other people feel bad.
Yeah.
At least 99% of the time they're not. But they're posting because they want to sometimes celebrate something that's happening in their life with their friend. But also, when I talk to young people, what I realize is many of them feel pressured to post things that make it seem like their life is positive and that everything is great. And this is and to me, what social media has forced us to confront is a fundamental question of our values, right? So if I went out onto this street corner, just outside this hotel, and I asked 100 people, what is your number one priority in life? I guarantee you that almost everybody would name a person, their spouse, their child, their parent, somebody in their life. But if we ask ourselves the question, is how we live our life commensurate with the priorities that we state? I can tell you that for my life, the answer is there's a gap. There's a big gap. That even though my parents and my sister and my wife and my 2 kids are my highest priorities, that I'm spending more time and attention and focus on other issues that might, seemingly contribute to the world. Maybe they can have a positive impact in the world, but it's different from what I state my priorities are. And the reality is that, especially when you look at social media and how young people, at the environment in which they're engaging and the content that's being posted, at the themes and values that are being supported, what you see is that what really seems to be equated with people's value is whether they're good looking enough, whether they have enough fame, whether they have enough material possessions, wealth, clothes, whatever it might be, whether they're in positions of authority, whether they have power. These are the things that are equated with success. And that carries out into the adult world as well, where being successful is about wealth, power, and reputation. And what I think we need to think about is, how do we shift our lived experience in the world? How do we shift the environment around us and design our technology, our workplaces, and our schools in ways that actually support the values that we want to live, which are people-centered values? And that's our challenge today. That's the challenge, I think, the fundamental challenge that we face as a society, not just in the United States, but around the world, is how do we build a people-centered society? Through the decisions we make in our own life about where we spend our time and who we spend our time with, to the design of our classroom curricula, to the design of our workplaces, to even the design of public policy, which right now does not account for the impact that it has on social connection and on human beings interacting with each other. This is fundamentally about how to restore the human values to human civilization.
Absolutely.
Values which we have allowed to slide and to be diluted over time, not because we're bad people, but because technology and so much of modern life have just raced ahead so fast that it's left us now trying to figure out what has happened and how we want to adjust.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I think there's been a movement without any intention to kind of glorify the me. So social media can do that too, right? Look at how amazing I am. Look at this beautiful thing I just did. Look at my beautiful this. And I'm hoping that we're on the cusp of another chapter, which is the we, right? Where's the we in this? You can be the best me possible and have a huge house and all the fame you want, and yet it's lonely and it's isolating. And what does it actually look like to create that we experience where we're together? And our policies support that, right? They support the we. And are there, I know your book is one expression of the path forward. Do you have other senses of things that you think we need to start thinking about in order to move in that direction?
Well, yes, and I will say parenthetically that this experience of writing this book was ironically very lonely and isolating. My wife,
there's people here who will talk to you about that. So.
My wife came up to me at one point in the middle, and she's like, after one long stretch where I just hadn't seen anybody for weeks on end, she's like, this book is like destroying us. It's terrible. Like, we got to do something different. But I will tell you that one of the things I think we need to do to shift more towards we is I think we have to think about what stories are we telling in our media, in our entertainment industry, and in our culture and conversation. Like the stories we tend to tell are the stories of the individual, the entrepreneur who built a company. So Apple is about Steve Jobs. Microsoft is about Bill Gates, not about the thousands of other people who were there to help create what they created. But similarly, we do the same in sports, right? We focus on Tom Brady, as the star quarterback of the New England Patriots. But without that offensive line, he couldn't be as good as he is. Without the wide receivers to catch the balls he throws, he couldn't be as good as he is. But we tend to do this often, and we do it in politics as well. And it causes challenges for us, because even like right now we're in the midst of a presidential primary. We'll have a presidential general election later this year. And what we often do is we try to find the one individual who can solve our problems, right? And vote for that person. But any individual, any politician who tells you that they and they alone can help solve the problems we have forgets how human society has evolved over thousands of years, and how all of us as human beings have evolved to work collectively. There's that old saying that many of you may know, that if you want to go fast, you go alone. If you want to go far, you go together. And that is the reality of our experience as human beings. And I think that this is our opportunity to think and to rethink and to recreate that cultural narrative. Because as much as we can think about what laws we should pass and what specific design we should apply to the workplace and to urban settings to encourage correct connection, the truth is that culture drives practice and structure and policy. And if the underlying values that we are speaking about and talking about and writing about and that we're showcasing, like in our highest forms, in our art, as well as in our spoken word, if those are not consistent with human values, then I worry that we will continue to chase the false gods of modern society, which are fame and wealth and reputation, which are not bad in and of themselves. It's not that you should never pursue, achievement in those respects. The problem is where they sit on the priority list. And because we've allowed people to slide lower and lower on our priority list, we have allowed ourselves to slide into a state where so many of us are struggling with loneliness, but we're afraid to admit it, not just to other people, but even to ourselves.
We just have a little less than a minute, but it makes me think of, is it the blue zones where people live very ancient? They're trying to figure out like what diet they're eating. Are they eating olives for breakfast, or what are they doing? And from what I understand, it's actually that the community where they find centenarians or other people who've lived many, many years. And so I feel like there's both a selfish personal interest if we want to live longer, but then there's also this community interest. And so I am totally behind that vision, and we just have a less than a minute left. Is there anything else you would like to say, leave us with?
It's a great point, and I think if you look at Blue Zones and the work Dan has done, there's been a lot of focus on the power of diet and the power of physical activity to extend our lifespan. Those are critical. But I think that what we have is an extraordinary opportunity now, because what we are starting to uncover and wake up to more and more is the extraordinary power of human connection to help us heal, to elevate our performance in school and in the workplace, and most importantly, to contribute to our fulfillment. The extraordinary thing about human connection is that it's all around us, that the ability to connect with others is one of our birthrights. It's not an ability we have to acquire from outside. You don't have to buy a special medicine or a special medical machine or a piece of equipment to become human beings who can connect with each other. This is who we are. And fundamentally, I believe that if we are able to return to a culture, to a world that is centered around human connection, what we are really doing is making a fundamental choice about living in a world that is grounded in love. Because that is what this is ultimately about. When I got on the plane to come here yesterday, I kissed my son, who is 3.5 years old, Tejas, and my daughter, Shanti, who's 2, goodbye, and told them I'd be back soon. And every time I do that, I ask myself, is this worth it to get on the plane and to be away from them? And the reason that I got on the plane this time, the reason I worked on this book, even though it meant time away from them, the reason I will continue to go out and to do whatever little I can to help build a more connected world, is because I really believe that their future and the future of all our children depend on a fundamental choice that we make about whether we want to live in a world that is driven and grounded in love, or whether we want to live in a world that is driven by fear. And right now, I worry that fear is driving much of what's happening. We see it particularly during election years when it's all in the media and people are being driven to be fearful of one candidate or another. But we all know from our individual lives that when we make decisions out of fear, it doesn't feel good. Mm-hmm. Living life mired in fear does not feel good, and it's stressful, and it's bad for our health in the long term as well. And so that's why I believe that this struggle to build a more connected world is the most important struggle of our time, because it affects everything else. If we can live a life that is grounded in love, we can be healthier. We can enhance our economic productivity. We can have kids who are more fulfilled. As one man told me, who I interviewed, had just gotten out of prison, he said to me, if you raise a child, you don't have to fix an adult. Wow. And that's what we have the opportunity to do. But it's an opportunity, but it doesn't mean it's just going to happen. It's about the choices we make that start in our everyday lives. Do we choose to pick up the phone when someone calls who we love? Do we choose to reach out to somebody to bridge a gap or a divide or a disagreement, even though we may feel stung by something someone said? Do we choose to give other people the benefit of the doubt before we choose to condemn them, even if they're people that we don't know, especially if they're people we don't know? And then what do we use our voices to talk about and to stand up for in the public square? Why do we choose what bills we support, what politicians we vote for? Are those based on values, or are they based on something else? These are the fundamental questions we have to confront ourselves with if we say that we want to live in a world that is driven by love and not driven by fear. And this is very personal to me, as I'm sure it is to all of you, because it's about us, it's about our kids, it's about the people that we love. And I want to know that after I'm gone, that if my child stumbles and falls, literally or metaphorically, that there will be people around him and her to lift them up. That if they make a mistake, that someone will give them the benefit of the doubt instead of condemning them from the outset. I want to know that they will live in a world that is ready to embrace them, not a world where everyone is preoccupied with themselves and with getting ahead. And that's the world we have the ability to create. Now, I'll lastly share that I think a lot about all the work that I've done in the hospital with patients before, work I feel very grateful for because it gave me such extraordinary experiences and insights into people's lives, insights I was just privileged to have because of their willingness to share. But I think about all the prescriptions I wrote in particular, all of those powerful antibiotics that I wrote to try to quell an infection, the medicines to treat people's high blood pressure, medicines to address their kidney disease. And when I think about it now, I realize that more powerful than all those medicines I wrote is the healing power of love. I could have never prescribed that, but the good thing is we don't need an MD or another degree in order to dispense love, to share it with the people around us. We all, in that respect, have the ability to be healers for ourselves, for the people around us, and for this world. And that's my ask of you, is that as you think about the rest of your lives and the influence you can have, that you not underestimate just how much power your love has, your compassion has, to heal the people around you. And when we do that together, we create a wave of healing that I believe can transform society, can transform our lives, our politics, and ultimately the future for our children.
Wow. Thank you. So you've all been given a doctor's prescription for love that's covered by all medical establishments. And thank you so much, Dr. Murthy, for your time and your presence.